Alright everybody, this is Red, and in this tutorial I am going to explain multiple types of low-speed suspensions for tanks and give a little bit of why we need them. In my next tutorial I'm going to cover more high-speed suspensions for tanks. Alright, so let's look at our initial chassis. This will explain also, while I drive this, why we need suspensions on our tanks. This vehicle, unsprung, and has all the problems that come with being unsprung. You have, unfortunately, rather crappy ride quality, very bouncy. If you hit sudden dips and ruts in the road, your vehicle will pitch up and down violently, and that really is not a good thing for combat vehicles. When you pitch up because you hit, a brick in the road or something, or a prop or whatever, you are exposing your belly. And that's not a good thing. That's usually the weakest spot on tanks. Furthermore, when you hit bumps, ruts, etc., when your vehicle is hitting difficult terrain, when you have no suspension, the force required to overcome that obstacle, much like, consider it as climbing a small gradient multiple times as it passes over your road wheels, this force is subtracted from your overall speed. So what this means is that part of the energy of your engine and the inertia of your vehicle is expended not on moving, but on overcoming this obstacle. In addition, with a vehicle like this which has no suspension on very difficult terrain, I'm going to go up on a hill and you can kind of see, you can see how some of the road wheels are not on the ground. Why would you want this? This you do not want. We want to have as many road wheels as possible on the ground so that we can have, even in adverse conditions, optimal traction for overcoming obstacles. In this way we can get to areas which our enemies may not be able to get to, and we can ensure adequate mobility. In addition to all of these features, your ride quality is very important in a tank because it affects very seriously your accuracy when you're firing on the move, which is an uncommon practice nowadays, but one which also has a very important role. In addition to all of these features, a vehicle which has all of its road wheels in constant contact with the same or a very controlled ground pressure, very controlled distribution of the weight to the road wheels, is also going to steer more effectively. The steering will be more predictable. The vehicle is capable of traveling over much more difficult terrain, is capable of traveling at higher speed, and firing more accurately while doing so. So these are all very often overlooked, very important aspects, which really cannot be understated as being important as part of a tank design. Alright, so I have been driving this small unsprung chassis around, and as you can see it is not fantastically, it would not be considered fantastically comfortable, nor to have particularly great mobility. It's alright, acceptable, but it could be better. It will have severe difficulty in handling rocky terrain or any sort of situation such as this where it really needs to have optimal traction. Right then. So, let's go back to where we started. Alrighty kids, this is the first suspension we are going to overlook, and this is a rigid bogie. You will notice that there are ropes. You can see a very triangular rope structure. There's also an invisible rope to the center from all four road wheels. This creates a pair of arms, which are, by the way, also axised together in most implementations of this suspension. though in this one they are not. This suspension has no springing. This really greatly limits its ability off-road in terms of speed. However, regardless of the fact that it does not have a whole lot of speed and springing and ride quality, it does have, compared to having an unsprung chassis, a little bit more mobility. The bogies are capable of flexing to a small degree, and this allows it to maintain better traction. As you can see, the road wheels dip and can oscillate over terrain. They are paired together, which keeps the overall angle of the vehicle equalized. If the vehicle impacts something to the front road wheel will lift up, pushing the second one down, and the equal force, the average between these two, will be transmitted to the body, rather than having the road wheel in the front transmit the entire force to the body. So we see a 50% reduction estimated in the actual amount of pitching up and down when you impact a single object. This suspension is very good for extremely low speed use. For use like this, where you have very little speed and you really need articulation and stability, this is your go-to. Almost all other suspensions eye cross-axis, and most people seem to as well. This way you have very, very high roll resistance. On this suspension, you do not need to do that, because the amount of travel of the road wheel is basically zero. There's no lateral flex possible. In essence, you don't need a roll bar because the wheels are already too rigid for it to matter. Kind of like how you don't really need any sort of anti-roll setup with a completely unsprung chassis. Here we're going to go over a small ditch and rut, and we'll just go over the road, and we will observe the road wheels. As you can see, the ride quality is not fantastic. It is very rough. It is definitely not, under any circumstances whatsoever, to be considered a high-speed suspension. This is the sort of thing which, outside of gmod, you would probably see on industrial equipment. You'll see things like this on bulldozers, track loaders, and on very low-speed tanks. This is not a suitable suspension for anything going over a few miles an hour. This is really barely suitable for anything other than an industrial chassis. I can see very, very low-speed specialized vehicles using it, and I've even seen it used in the rear suspension before of a truck. But this uncommon suspension is really only designed for going at very low speed with a very high amount of weight. It is an alternative to being unsprung in that case, so it has a very much of a niche use. Its construction, as you can see, as I've already explained, is just a pair of rope trailing arms, advanced ball sockets to keep the wheels upright to the body, and a road wheel to road wheel rigid rope. This road wheel to road wheel rigid rope is what prevents the wheels from flopping, having any springing, etc. Generally good system for low speed use. But unfortunately, it's quite terrible for high-speed use. It has the total amount of springing for vertical oscillation as being completely unsprung. Alrighty, now that we have finished this, let's look at our next suspension type. This is another low-speed suspension, but this one is a little more adaptable, and this is the leaf spring suspension. Leaf spring bogies are a little bit more practical. You can see fairly easily the construction. They have the same axle rope leading and trailing arm arrangement. You have a rope often from bugger all. You have a rope which goes from the road wheel to a corner, And you have also a rope which goes from the road wheel to the center. In these vehicles, there's no limiters. This is your spring. It is a light prop, usually placed under armor. This is access to the body with an advanced ball socket, which restricts the angle with which it can rotate, and the road wheels are access to it. The road wheels have no individual limiters. They are connected directly to the spring. The spring is free to pivot up and down, which allows a degree of interconnection, and they provide a small amount of springing. It's really a quite simple system. You just have a pair of road wheels on short arms clamped to a leaf spring. And this system is good for lower speeds as well, but this is a little more adaptable. You have a definite increase in ride quality. It's still rather stiff, of course, but it is definitely much better than previous designs. As you can see, watching it, it's smoother. There's actually a degree of springing involved. The body doesn't simply just flop down, and at the same time you have interconnection. Now it is very stiff. It is very well suited for taking heavy loads. It is also very well suited for handling difficult terrain, due to the fact that the road wheels have a significant amount of travel, despite having relatively limited springing. It's really very good for anything which is relatively slow, but needs to be maneuverable and mobile on difficult terrain. This covers anything from Panzerjägers to infantry support tanks to really anything. This suspension in real life was very popular through the 20s to early 40s, and was seen also, if you are a tank fan, on the Jagdpanzer 38P, also known as the Hetzer, seen on the Panzer 38P, and variations of it with two-wheel and four-wheel bogies were found on virtually every tank. The Panzer IV used this suspension. Almost every Russian tank of the 20s and 30s, apart from the BT series, used it with interconnected bogies of 4 road wheels instead of 2. However, doing a 4 road wheel bogie and managing to have it have the bulking oscillation capabilities, much more difficult in Gmod due to the fact that you would have to use a separate prop in almost any arrangement. And really, with these sort of things, ropes are generally the way to go. The geometry available by ropes, the rigidity, and the fact that you cannot destroy a rope by shooting it, nor can a rigid rope add to the mass of the vehicle, plus they're simply stronger. So these are very, very good. Very, very good for low speeds. For high speeds, these are not as well suited. As you can see, it has relatively limited overall spring travel, but it is supple. It certainly works. It's certainly better than a completely unsprung unit, and is a good suspension choice. In the push to simplify design, and in the drive to adapt this concept to higher speed vehicles, a variant of this is designed, which is much more suited towards high speed travel. Also, before I go into that, I'm going to mention that both of these variants, like virtually all tank suspensions I make, there is an axis, a rigid axis between the left and right road wheels on each side, so that it basically functions as a super strong roll bar. The slight deformation allowed by Source's physics makes it function like an actual roll bar, as well as obviously having the advanced ball socket keeping the wheels upright to the body. But anyways, that makes it actually very stable with large amounts of weight on the top of the vehicle. Really, at that point, you start to have where the width of the tracks has more effect on vehicle movement and vehicle stability than the actual road wheels twisting and having the suspension be part of the equation. There's nothing really that a suspension can do about that. So, on that note, let's go take a look at our final low-speed suspension. This was a design completely created by myself, and it is a good medium-speed suspension. It is good for vehicles in the 10 to 30 mile an hour range of speed. In fact, you could even put it on vehicles faster. Broadly comparable to something such as the Volute Spring Bogie. This consists of a single spring located usually slightly under the floor of the hull. Of course, it's protected by armor. We have it out here and exposed so that you can see it. We also normally have all of these springs parented, but as I'm doing this for demonstration purposes, they are unparented. You'll notice the road wheels are much lower in this one. In the standard leaf spring suspension, we want it so that if there is no springing, one road wheel goes up, the other goes down, and it'll act like a lever. In this, we do not take that approach. The road wheels are drooped much, much lower, and we have these rope-looking things, our limiters. They also demonstrate, you must remember, that 2 times the length of this rope is the total amount of travel. So we have this bar, which is access to our base, and all 4 road wheels are access to this bar. This bar is limited in its pitching to, I believe, 15 degrees, although you can limit it to larger values. There's also this red thing here is a stretch-only elastic, which functions as both a spring and a shock absorber and is connected to the base of the vehicle. This provides damping. It's not really necessary to have such shock absorbers on a leaf spring suspension, because the leaf spring suspension doesn't really have the travel. There's not really as much travel available in it, so there's really not a whole lot of need for a shock absorber. This is one of the reasons why a lot of real-life leaf springs did not have shock absorbers. Partly also interleaf friction provides its own shock dampening. This combines not all, but most of the interconnective features of the first 2 suspensions, while at the same time providing better ride quality at high speed, and most, if not all, of the same terrain mobility. So if you have something that's very slow, a leaf spring or even rigid mount would be better. But for something which has to function over a broad range of vehicle speeds, you would want to have something like this. This combines interconnection with a good amount of spring travel and shock absorption. Very comparable to something such as the American horizontal volute spring suspension, or if you are particularly knowledgeable on tanks, the Italians did a torsion bar suspension, which was both. Here we can see me driving around. You'll notice the ride quality is a bit better than the leaf springs. The vehicle has a great degree of stability, comfortable shock absorption, and is surprisingly mobile over difficult terrain even. If you remember that snowbank earlier, we could not cross with a rigid suspension. And yet with a vehicle like this, which has road wheels which are capable of oscillating and grabbing over the terrain, no problem. Handles it perfectly. If we were to run at high speed directly into this wall, that low wall right there. An unsprung vehicle would probably bounce off or bounce up. Very unpredictable, throw off your aim, definitely do bad things to your armor angles and expose weak points. Instead, we have this. Clambers right over like a trooper. Not quite managing to get over that snowbank. It's a fairly steep one. But we obviously have much greater articulation in previous suspension types, with the exception of leaf springs and those rigid mounts. So it's much better, much better to have a suspension, as you can see. Your mobility is much better. And I could see myself shooting on the move much more effectively with a vehicle such as this. Especially over something such as a washboard course. Now the interconnection of the bogies is very important, obviously, because it decreases your forward-to-back force, the pitching of your suspension. It's also good for the mobility too, as we've seen. So trying to maintain that in a high-speed suspension is very important. And this sort of design really takes the interconnected bogie design as far as it can go. The use of a single spring and having the spring in the center simplifies the design and also is more practical. Leaf springs don't really function quite the same when they are located this close to the wheel. Elevating them up makes them heavier. So we'll give the leaf spring a comparison on off to a circle around. You can see the difference. Leaf springs are really more oriented towards industrial equipment, vehicles like that. They are good for low speed. The rigid mount is good for very low speed. In the suspension I showed you, the central torsion bogie spring, whatever, I really don't know what to call it. We'll just call it Red's bogies. Red's bogies are good for handling medium speeds and having yet still at the same time very good terrain mobility. Alright. You can add a shock absorber with a leaf spring suspension, but it's really not necessary. As you may have noticed, I have a little bit of ang force damping, but I don't have a lot of that. The distance from a prop spring to the wheel does not only determine the amount of weight of the spring that's necessary, as props that are closer have much props that are closer have more strength. But in addition to this, the progressiveness of the spring rate is very different. Leaf springs in real life, especially even model leaf springs like what I use in Long Life, are very sharply exponential. The springiness grows because of the way that the leaf forms. I'm Rid. This has been my tutorial, part 1 of my tank suspension tutorials. Tune in part 2, where I will be going over various high-speed suspensions which are more suited to vehicles such as cavalry tanks, light tanks, and main battle tanks of the faster design, because the Chieftain doesn't really count. Alright.